This is the Žižek Dictionary entry for Schelling, Indivisible Remainder, by Joseph Carew. Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling was, along with Immanuel Kant, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, one of the most crucial philosophers in the tradition of German idealism, the founding insights and problematics of which were first laid out in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. Once a colleague and friend of Hegel, with whom he even studied during his youth, accompanied by the poet Friedrich Hölderlin at the Tübinger Stift, Schelling eventually became one of his most venomous critics, coming into the German intellectual scene at the age of 19 as a disciple of Fichte, with works such as Of the I as the Principle of Human Knowledge in 1795, then showing zeal as a self-standing thinker, with various sketches of a Naturphilosophie from 1797 to 1799, and The System of Transcendental Idealism in 1800, which were in turn followed by a series of distinctively original metaphysical speculations known as the Philosophy of Identity from 1801 to 1809. Schelling very quickly became something of a precocious philosophical superstar during the high days of German idealism before the rise of Hegel. His work is difficult to situate unequivocally, not only because his corpus is filled with rich texts covering diverse topics, often delivered in an idiosyncratic style that changes from one to the next, but also because he was witness to and saw the death of many of the era's great movements, not only Romanticism, Naturphilosophie, and Hegelianism, but also his own, namely, German idealism as a whole. In standard interpretations, Schelling is often seen, largely thanks to Hegel's History of Philosophy, as a transitory figure between the subjective idealism of Fichte, which reduces all experiential reality to the product of the absolute I, or ego, and the absolute idealism of Hegel, which explains being and thinking by recourse to a dialectical negativity that ties both together through a unity in difference. This view, however, is intrinsically problematic. Not only does it fail to take notice of the fact that Hegel did not have access to some of Schelling's most important works, such as The Ages of the World, various drafts of which were written in 1811 through 15, yet published only posthumously, but it also importantly ignores the fact that Schelling continued to live and produce philosophy over 20 years after the death of Hegel. What renders Žižek's reading of Schelling, as epitomized in the Indivisible Remainder, so crucial and challenging in this context is his disregard of this standard interpretation, and his attempt to situate Schelling in what he refers to as the Grundoperation des deutschen Idealismus, the fundamental elementary operation of German idealism. Two aspects of this interpretive move deserve to be underlined. First, it argues for Schelling's irreducible and radically pivotal contribution to German idealism's central theoretical problematic in the face of Hegel's critique and our still widespread understanding of the movement. Second, it suggests that Žižek's reading of Schelling is a means by which he cultivates his own theory of subjectivity, perhaps even jeopardizing his own characterization of his philosophy as Hegelian. Following many interpreters, Žižek divides Schelling's philosophy into distinct periods, each of which demonstrates a distinct philosophical approach to an underlying problematic, namely, the problematic of late German idealism. How does being come into phenomenalization in consciousness and language? With both Kant and Fichte failing to provide an answer to the problem of reconciling realism and idealism, the materialism of the body, and the freedom of the subject, Schelling is concerned with how we can develop a system inclusive of the two, as Hegel will be in turn. Schelling's solution is to replace matter and mind with a dynamic interplay of real and ideal powers, that structurally repeat or become more complex at different potencies throughout the great chain of being. However, the Absolute itself is neither real nor ideal, but indifferent to both. It is the neutral container within which the real and ideal exist as charged opposites and yet are identified in absolute reason. This is at the heart of Hegel's infamous critique of the Schellingian absolute as the night in which all cows are black. For Žižek, what is problematic here, and what Schelling himself comes to realize, is the necessity by which mind emerges out of matter, subject from substance, through the self-unfolding play of nature's potencies, which Schelling explicates by rational deductions. It suffocates the freedom it was meant to explain. Consequently, Schelling, of the period of philosophical investigations into the essence of human freedom and the ages of the world, especially the second existent draft, seeks to comprehend how the subject can explode out of substance as a pure event. But since such an emergence or self-positing cannot be predicted in the movement of matter, as Žižek puts it, logical deduction must give way to mythical narrative. A retroactive attempt to explain the impossible origins of consciousness and language out of a world that is intrinsically meaninglessness. Although these texts are usually read as part of Schelling's theological turn, what is so daring about Žižek is his argument that when Schelling appears to be describing the birth of God, he is in fact supplying us with a mythopoetic account of the contingent arising of the symbolic out of the real. Like Freud and Lacan, Schelling is principally a metapsychological thinker. What Schelling theorizes, a point merely hinted at by Kant in his concept of unruliness, and Hegel in his evocation of the night of the world, is that we cannot pass directly into the universe of meaning, an insight later thematized by psychoanalysis, and which opens the possibility of reading the German idealist and psychoanalytical tradition through one another. First, nature must produce an unnatural monstrosity. There must be a moment of thoroughly perverted, denaturalized, derailed nature which is not yet culture, but paradoxically makes room for the latter as a response to an ontological catastrophe. Seeking to reconcile the real and the ideal, Schelling stumbles upon the obscure origins of subjectivity, the status of the uncanny X that precedes the transcendentally constituted reality, with an unsurpassed intensity. Not only is Schelling the first to formulate this view, but he also gave the most detailed account of this X in his notion of the ground of existence, which places his philosophy at the origins of dialectical materialism. Although Schelling is thus perhaps the thinker of subjectivity for Žižek, his greatness is his own downfall. In the drafts of The Ages of the World, he repeatedly fails to posit this intermediate step. The psychotic rotation of drives in nature Žižek compares to an animal stuck in a trap. In The Birth of Consciousness and Language, Schelling can only cope with this insight by its repression. We see this when Schelling, attempting a new reconciliation, argues that philosophy can, by a priori principles, deduce the structure of the world, but since the whatness of the world cannot explain that it is, negative philosophy must be supplemented by a positive philosophy whose goal is to test the findings of reason's deductions. This task is embarked upon by Schelling of the philosophy of mythology and revelation, which Žižek qualifies as a regression to pre-modern essentialism in the aftermath of his own account of the dialectical materialist explosion of the ideal out of the real. Schelling's theory of the subject as part of the theocosmic drama of God's search for self-revelation appears as a desperate attempt at a meta-language to cover up a trauma, the trauma that is the subject and its disjointed place in being. Žižek presents us with a radical, controversial, and original psychoanalytical rendering of the trajectory of Schelling's long career, which argues for its importance. However, the role of Schelling in Žižek's own thinking is difficult to assess. On the one hand, the problematic that he identifies as Hegelian, namely, how does appearance itself emerge from the interplay of the real, is actually, on his own reading, what is most distinctively Schellingian, since Žižek's theoretical endeavor is fundamentally concerned with the very rise of representation or appearing out of the flat stupidity of being. Schelling must be paramount to it. On the other hand, despite ephemeral moments of breakthrough that emerge, as it were, in a flash, Žižek insists that Schelling remains philosophically inferior to his great rival. Yet, if Žižek is right to say that the Grundoperation des deutschen Idealismus is the vanishing mediator between the real and the ideal, the founding gesture of subjectivity in catastrophe that both Hegelian dialectics and Schellingian ontology attempt to repress, then Žižek's own theory of the subject may be a dynamic hybridism of elements from both.